Hi, human geographers. This video is over topic 1.4, spatial concepts. And so your objective coming from College Board here is that you should be able to define major geographic concepts that illustrate spatial relationships. And so I've already said spatial twice, and I'm going to say it a million more times in this video. And this is because the spatial perspective and spatial relationships is the way that geographers basically analyze the world around them. And so the spatial perspective is made up of kind of a series of questions. Geographers ask themselves, what kind of piece of data or what information am I looking at? And then they ask themselves, where is it located? Right? Finally, they ask, why is it located there and why should I care? Right? And so we kind of like summarize this with what, where, why there, why care, right? These are kind of the four big questions that kind of make up this spatial perspective. And so you're basically just asking yourself, why are these particular concepts located where they are? And so that leads us to this number 5 here, is that geographers are constantly looking for patterns on the cultural landscape. So you'll probably see this kind of analysis page multiple times, because this is going to be what is going to help us think like a geographer and have that spatial perspective. And so when they're answering the question, what? First thing to consider is place. And so we've already talked about place a little bit in a previous video. And so when we're describing what a location is like, right, we're going to think about things like the sense of place. And this is a factor that contributes really to the uniqueness or the originality of a location, right? And so, you can see here, I've got the Eiffel Tower, right? This is an actual a piece of the built environment, which I'll talk about here in a second, that creates a sense of place in Paris, right? Another example that I have here is the gondolas kind of going through the canal in Italy, right? This is something that's very popular and gives a sense of uniqueness to that location. And so the cultural landscape or the built environment, these are both kind of similar topics that work together. It's basically the physical things or artifacts that humans create, which make up what we see in a place, the landscape, right? And so oftentimes, you've heard of landscaping, right? That's when people are like cutting the grass and planting flowers and bushes and stuff like that. Well, the cultural landscape or the built environment, think of us as humans, right? As planting our little pieces of culture and things that we've created onto kind of the world. So everything in the cultural landscape and the built environment is human produced, okay? So like, for example, Mount Sinai is not a part of the cultural landscape because humans didn't produce that, right? However, the Eiffel Tower, for example, was human produced, right? And it gives this sense of place to the cultural landscape in Paris. And then finally, I realize this is cut off a little bit at the end. We need to discuss placelessness. And this is a location really without any sense of place. They don't have really, if a place is placeless, it doesn't necessarily have a distinct kind of influence or culture. And so an example of this would be like if you're driving down Glenway, right? There's a Target, there's an Outback, there's a Staples, there's a Bed Bath & Beyond, a Michael's, right? Like I'm just thinking of that like first like shopping center. There's a Panda Express, there's a Rue 21. All of those things can be found basically anywhere in the United States, right? There's no sense of place like the Eiffel Tower that's really distinguishing that location more than other locations. So after geographers ask themselves, what am I looking at? What is the sense of place I'm trying to figure out? They're going to ask themselves where, right? How do we describe where a place is located? Well, we use location. And so, we've previously talked about the difference between absolute and relative location, right? So, absolute location is going to be something like latitude and longitudinal, right? Coordinates. It's precise, it's measurable, it's exact. Whereas relative location has to do with relationships, right? Where is this place in location to other places? Now, a few different ways that we can talk about location that we haven't discussed yet. A toponym. This is an important term that you'll probably come across a lot. A toponym is just the geographic term for a location's name, right? And so names are actually pretty interesting because they are reflective of the values and the history and the culture of the people who chose that name. So, like, for existence, places like Georgetown, right? There's a bunch of Georgetowns across the US. Well, this is directly tied to the history of the establishment of the United States, right? So, the people who came to the US first from overseas, not the Native Americans that were already living here, um, they left King George of England to come to live in the colonies of the US, right? So that's why you see a lot of Georgetowns, right, that are kind of scattered along the East Coast. Another example is Washington, right? Washington, D.C., Washington State, and then there are also other kind of towns named Washington as well. Well, what does that reflect, right? That reflects our country's first president. And so toponyms reveal things about people's religion, their culture, their history, stuff like that. So again, we're asking ourselves, how do we describe where a place is located, right? We can use absolute location, relative location, toponyms, and then finally, site or the physical landscape. So last slide, I talked about the cultural landscape and the built environment, right? And so when I'm talking about site or the physical landscape, this basically means all of the environmental features of a location. So things like climate, topography, vegetation, elevation, all of those kind of different physical features that we would consider about a location, right? And so this is a map of elevation throughout the world, and you can see the red means higher elevation, and the green's going to mean lower elevations. And so we can see, the Aegean mountain range right here as being very highly elevated, and this kind of Tibetan plateau here, right? So again, how do we describe where a place is located? We use kind of like these four different types of location: absolute location, relative location, toponym, and then site or the physical landscape. So I just wanted to take a second and talk to you real briefly about climate. Um, because we're definitely going to talk about climate a lot in this class. And so it's a good idea for you to kind of have a basic kind of concept of the climate regions. So places that are in tropical latitudes. And so a tropical latitude is going to be near the equator. Okay, so you can see the equator is right here, kind of cuts the world in half. So locations that are closer to that equator are going to have those tropical environmental conditions, right? You can see tropical wet and dry, and then we kind of get into the arid and semi-arid areas, right? And so the reason why those are hotter, right, and tropical, is because those locations are getting more rays from the sun all year long. And so that's kind of a result, or I'm sorry, the hot weather is a result of that. Now, places at high latitudes. So you can see all of this purple up here, right? This is a high latitude. These are receiving a lot less sunlight. So, it's still light there, but the rays of the sun are not as strong. And so that's why, kind of a simple way of understanding why those places are colder all year round. Now, something else that you need to know is that elevation is also going to impact climate as well. Okay, so this cut off a little bit for you. Oh, there you go. You can see places at high elevations, right, are going to have colder climates than those places that are further down or closer to sea level. And this is because the sea actually cools. So, just kind of a quick conversation about climate. Like I said, we're going to continue to come back to this. But, if you can just know at this point, the closer you are to the equator, the higher temperature, and the more tropical like climate is going to be located. And then the higher altitudes, the colder it's going to be. And the higher latitudes, the colder it's going to be. So again, when I'm asking myself, let's go back to these questions, what, right? What is the temperature, right? Where am I finding those temperatures, right? So if I'm doing high temperature, I'm finding it close to the equator, right? Why am I finding high temperatures close to the equator? And this is because it gets more direct sunlight, more direct sun rays. Why do I care? That's really basically the whole course, right? So, what kind of agriculture is going to be produced in this tropical climate close to the equator, right? How are people going to create their buildings? How is that climate going to affect people's culture? What are they going to be wearing? That's different than people who are living, in the tundra. These are all of the why cares that we're going to get to through this course. So let's talk about patterns now, right? So we just talked about how do we describe what a location is like? How do we describe where a place is located? And so now let's talk about patterns. We've already discussed these in a previous video. But I'm going to go over them one more time, right? So when we're talking patterns in human geo, you never want to say something like, these traits are close together, right? That's not a geographic term. You want to use something like the term clustered, right? So, like, for example, if these are people, right? These people are clustered together, meaning that they are close together, right? These people are far apart. We don't say far apart, we're going to say dispersed, right? It's just some geographic terms. And remember, we also previously talked about density and distribution, right? So density is the number of something in a defined area. So all of these have the exact same density, right? Because it's the same number of dots in this kind of square, right? So they actually all have the same density, although this square is clustered and this square is dispersed. So we'll talk a little bit more about density in our unit number 2. But just know, kind of right off the bat, when we're talking about clustering, we also might add on some conversations about density as well. Also, distribution, right? This is the way that something is spread out over an area, right? So I would say in this box, this kind of dispersed box, these people are widely distributed, right? They're taking up basically the whole space in the box. Now, when I look at the clustered one, I would say that these people are not widely distributed, right? They're not really spread out. They're actually close together. They're clustered and they're not distributed, okay? Or they're not dispersed. So those are just kind of like simple little language changes that are going to help you in the long run be able to really rock out an FRQ. And then finally, um, right, we already talked about patterns and spatial associations, but we're still kind of hammering on that pattern concept because that's what geographers do. They look for patterns. And so a spatial association is this indication that two or more phenomena are related, they're associated, they're correlated, they go together, they have some sort of relationship, right? So being a geographer is really like looking at those patterns and trying to connect the puzzle pieces to figure out kind of what is the relationship, what is the connection between, two pieces of information, maybe. So, patterns can also be kind of discussed and determined through the process of regionalization. And so, regions are basically just tools that geographers use to divide and categorize space into smaller areas of analysis. Now, that's a really complicated way to say that geographers basically look at the world in pieces, right? Again, I told you it's like collecting puzzle pieces. And we're going to talk about regions a little bit more in kind of like a couple of days. However, I just want you to think right now, right? We can determine patterns and we can discuss patterns by discussing regions. Okay. And so these are kind of some regions of the world. And we'll talk, like I said, more about that later. Okay. So now that we're done talking about, how do we determine patterns, let's talk about the why there and the why cares, right? These are spatial interactions, basically. It's us figuring out what are the connections, the contacts, the flow of characteristics or people or, data between places or locations. So that definition of spatial interaction is just a really fancy way of saying how are places connected, right? And so there are some geographic concepts that you need to know here. Okay. We use geographic concepts to explain this kind of connectedness or lack of connectedness between these places and locations or phenomena or whatever. And so, two geographic concepts that we will continuously discuss in this course is distance decay and time space compression. They are opposites. Okay. And so think about when something decays, right? It falls apart. And so you can probably just use context clues to understand that distance decay means that as places become further away from each other, right? Um, they are less likely to be connected. And so you can see the official definition here is the interaction between two places or locations, right, declines as the distance between those two places increases. So, like, let me give you an example, right? There are some physical barriers that can get in the way of places being connected, right? Large mountains, rivers, oceans, the desert, right? These are examples of physical barriers that are going to create distance decay. Okay. If a human being cannot, doesn't have the technology or the ability to climb a mountain, then chances are they're not going to be able to spread whatever they're trying to spread. Right. Now, there are also cultural barriers. And I think this one's a little bit more understandable for us. So, for example, let's say that there is a new trend in Saudi Arabia, right? Um, People in Saudi Arabia typically speak Arabic, and their religion is Muslim, right? And so those might be some cultural barriers that would prevent the spread of that new trend from Saudi Arabia to the United States, right? Because a lot of people in the US don't understand Arabic. So, how are we supposed to understand this kind of new trend if we can't understand what they're saying? Right. So that's an example of like a cultural barrier that would cause distance decay. Right. So the further away places are, the less likely they are to be connected. So time-space compression is literally the exact opposite. It is this increasing sense of being connected to distant places, right? And this is all because of globalization. Globalization is the idea, basically, that due to increased technology, transportation, and communication, we around the world are more connected than we have ever been before. So, like, for example, um, think about before cell phones were made, before even landline telephones were made. How did people communicate? Well, they sent letters, right? Um, and so, how long would it take a letter to be sent from, New York, let's say, to your friend in Tokyo? Right? Weeks and weeks and weeks. And so globalization really is spurred when we start to see the increased technology and transportation techniques that really kind of bridge that gap of, however many weeks it takes a letter to get to Tokyo. Now we can simply send a text message, right? And it'll get there immediately. Or pick up the phone and call, or get on a Google Meet together, right? So we are able to be close to one another, although we are not physically together, right? That's the idea of time space compression. We're all getting closer together. So, one other way, let me remind you here, why there and why care. Some other kind of geographic concepts that we're going to use to explain, how places and locations are connected or not connected, is the idea of diffusion. Diffusion basically means movement. It's the process by which something, a characteristic, spreads from one place to another place. Okay. And so think about, like, when I'm talking about time space compression, right? This diffusion is rapidly increasing, right? Diffusion is very fast. And so this is a great example of that time space compression. If you look from 1500 to 1850, right? The best average speed of horse drawn coaches or sailing ships was 10 miles an hour. So the world was huge. It took a very long time for things to diffuse or spread, right? But you can see from the period of 1850 to 1930, we've gotten new inventions in transportation and technology like steam locomotives, so steam trains or steamships. This is enabling people and things to move more quickly, right? And spread more quickly. And so the world gets a little bit smaller, right? We're kind of compressing, we're becoming more connected. In the 1950s, you can see a propellered aircraft is able to travel from 300 to 400 miles per hour. We're getting even smaller, even more connected, even more diffusion. And then finally, you can see in the 60s, we are able to kind of harness this jet passenger aircraft, which can move at speeds up to 700 miles per hour, right? So, time space compression enables diffusion, right? As the world gets smaller, as we get more communication technology, right? As we get more transportation technology, the characteristics are going to be able to spread from one place to another much more quickly. Now, there still may be physical or cultural barriers, right? And that's when distance decay comes into play. Okay, so before we kind of move forward, I just want to quickly introduce you to the idea that there are different types of diffusion. We're going to cover this a lot more in Unit 3. However, I want you to kind of just basically know the two major categories of diffusion is expansion diffusion or relocation diffusion. Okay. And so expansion diffusion is the idea that characteristics kind of spread to the people that are around kind of that initial hearth, or the initial start of a characteristic. So like, for example, I've got the mask here, right? Think about expansion diffusion like an illness, right? If I sneeze on you, chances are that if I'm sick, you will probably contract whatever illness that I have, right? I'm kind of expanding to the people around me that characteristic of illness. Relocation diffusion is kind of the opposite. It's not necessarily that I'm spreading to people around me simultaneously. Relocation diffusion means that I am physically getting up and moving, let's say, from the United States all the way over to Japan, right? And I am taking pieces of my culture and my characteristics with me. And so, kind of to wrap up, this whole topic here, the why there and the why care. We're talking about these geographic concepts of spatial interaction, right? Distance decay, time-space compression, and diffusion. All three of these geographic concepts basically tell us a little bit about why something is connected or why it is not connected. Okay, so before we leave, I just want to do a quick spatial analysis with you, right? What, where, what are the patterns, why there, and why care, right? So you can see here, I've got two maps of China. And so the what that I'm looking at here is I'm looking at population density first. And so you can see if I look at this kind of map legend here, at the size of these dots, so this is a little bit of a proportional symbol map, indicate how many people are living in these urban cities. Okay, so the larger the dot, the more people are living there. So the largest dots is actually over 8 million people. And the colors are indicating to me the population density, right? So the darker the color, right, the purple color is going to be the highest rate of population density, over 250 people per square mile. And the yellow here indicates the lower level of population density, meaning that there's under 2 people per square mile, okay? So are people clustered, right? Or are they dispersed? That's a way to kind of think about it geographically. Now let's look at the map. So I can see that some of the largest cities here in China are Beijing and Shanghai, and there's a few kind of larger cities around the coastal area as well, but those are kind of like my two major cities. And then there you can see there's a cluster, right, of big cities down here in the south. Okay. So what? I've thought about population density and urban population. Okay. Now I'm going to look at, why basically we've decided, kind of, you can see here, that the population is clustered along this kind of eastern side of China, right? Over here in the west, it's actually a very, very low population density, and you can see there's only one major city, and it's sitting around about 1 million people, which seems like a lot, but when you compare that to over 8 million, it's kind of small, right? So what kind of patterns am I going to see now if I kind of compare it to something else? So now let's look at this map. This is concentration of particulate matter, which is basically like a way to measure pollution. Okay, air pollution to be exact. And so if you look at this map now, you can see that the darker the color red, the more severe of a health impact that air pollution has on the people living there. And you can see the oranges kind of is showing that, it's unhealthy for certain groups, but the red is basically indicating it's unhealthy for all humans, right? And then you can see the blue is kind of a moderate level of a health effect. And then finally, the gray is not surveyed. And so, what kind of pattern am I noticing? Well, let's start here with the what. I am noticing high levels of air pollution, right? In this portion right here between Beijing, Shanghai, and Wuhan, right? There's like a little triangle here of air pollution. And so that's the what and the where. Now, what kind of patterns am I seeing between these two maps? Well, the higher the population density and the bigger the cities are, the more air pollution I am noticing, right? So, why is that there, right? Why is this air pollution here? Well, one thing we can talk about is population density, but we can also talk about, what is happening in these cities that is causing that high pollution. And so I think the why care is pretty obvious, right? There's a huge health impact on this amount of air pollution in these areas. So that really has to do with the people that are living there. And so before we kind of like finish this off, I also just wanted to show you this. I think it's so interesting. Look at these two different maps. This is also a map of air pollution. You can see in China before and after the coronavirus quarantine. And so we know that coronavirus originated here in the hearth at Wuhan, um, and you can still kind of see it's not as exact, but our kind of triangle here, Beijing, Wuhan, Shanghai of air pollution. And it looks like there was kind of a lot, a little bit north of Beijing as well. And so this was like the maybe I think it was like a month before the quarantine began, and this map actually shows that particulate matter during the quarantine in China through the coronavirus. So again, what is it? It's air pollution. Where is it located? We just talked about that. What is the pattern? I can tell that these big cities are obviously less active because their air pollution has decreased significantly during a quarantine. So, the purpose of this whole video, right? Your standard here, your objective is that you need to be able to define and utilize geographic concepts to illustrate spatial relationships. So you should look over your notes and make sure that you feel you feel confident that you can kind of answer this. And if you have any questions, like always, please ask me in class.